But guess what? Criminals don't they know that, right? And they always try to choose the easiest way to enter into a certain company.
Hi everyone, my name is Miguel Magalhães. I'm the head of content and partnerships at the Next Big Idea. And in this edition of Web Summit, we are conducting a series of interviews with the support of the EIF, where we're going to talk with a series of investors and companies discussing the innovation ecosystem here in Europe. With me, I have Carlos Alberto Silva, the co-founder and managing partner of 33 Ventures. Carlos, thank you very much for
Thank you.
joining us.
Thank you
And
for having me.
yeah, and I would like to start out by asking you kind of what has been the journey of 33N in a very specific space and a very
Yep.
particular area where more people are going to and asking for advice. And so, how has it been these last years in terms of building your portfolio, giving your expertise in such an important area nowadays like cybersecurity?
It's a good first question because actually when we say 33 Ventures is the European VC specialized in cybersecurity and infrastructure software investing globally, and then we say that we are based in Portugal. Of all the places, people kind of get surprised, right?
Yeah.
Because it's not the most obvious region to have a specialized investor in an area where the awareness and the top of mind is absolutely peaking, right? So the story, there's a bit of serendipity in this journey, to be honest. So the background of myself and my partner, engineering, telecoms. I did a lot of M&A globally in the past. I also led a merger here in Portugal between two telcos. But then after that, we kind of created a corporate VC, or we were at the inception of a corporate VC in a well-known group here in Portugal. And we started with this flexible mandate around let's do investments in tech, let's leverage the expertise we have and the track record doing investments globally. And we were familiar with tech, but of course we were kind of biased to telecom, right? But telecom was kind of maturing, so we went after a new area. And there you go, the first twist. We elected cybersecurity as the area that we should look at. Of course, more than 10 years ago, cybersecurity is not what it is today.
Yeah.
So today is completely top of mind. And but we started the journey, and then I mentioned the first twist, but there was a second one, which was we actually started not by doing VC, but we started by doing or building through M&A a pan-European cybersecurity services provider. And of course, the opportunity was very clear there. So the market was heavily fragmented in Europe. Europe as a whole is a bit fragmented, as we
Yeah.
know. But then, long story short, we did 4 acquisitions. We've created one of the largest cybersecurity service providers, again, out of Portugal, and the acquisitions were mostly outside Portugal, as you can imagine. But we built this pan-European play, 600 experts. We sold it to Thales, still within the corporate VC. But that came, so that journey, besides the value that created not only for the corporate VC we were at, but also for the founders that were involved in those transactions, it gave us two elements that are differentiating, really differentiating in the landscape of the cybersecurity specialized investors, which was on one side the exposure to the services. So we were coming from telecoms, as you know, right?
Yeah.
So we kind of were able to build the expertise because we were within that operation, right? So facing the customer. And that expertise is critical because it allows you in such an overwhelming ecosystem, so more than 4,000 startups, it allows you to identify the interesting or the most promising spaces, right?
Yeah.
So that's one. But then there's a second element. So besides being able to navigate the ecosystem, you also need to have a value proposition to offer to those companies, right? Because otherwise you are just another one
Yeah.
on the queue, right? So and our value proposition started to be quite naturally offering support to help companies to be in contact with precisely the service providers, the cybersecurity service providers. And we did 4 acquisitions, but of course, to do 4 acquisitions, a lot of them failed. So we spoke with dozens of potential targets, right, as you can imagine. And we built relationships. So today, when I invest in a company in Europe or I invest in a company in the US, one of the things that they recognize that we can bring to the table is precisely helping them expand across Europe.
Yeah.
So abstracting a bit the fragmentation that we have, right? So that's how it started, and we were in a corporate VC, so we did around 20 investments there. We became, so based on the serendipity,
Yeah.
but we became a bit a leading cybersecurity, or recognized as one of the leading cybersecurity specialized investors in Europe. And again, Europe, there are a few, not a lot.
Yeah.
We should have way more than we have, but they are mostly local and mostly early stage.
Yeah.
And we bring this pan-European layer, right? So we
Very
kind
important.
of we enter after they help the company create a product. So we invest Series A, Series B, when the company is ready to expand commercially, right?
Yeah.
And that resonates to European startups,
Yeah.
but it also resonates to companies coming from other regions, because
Yeah.
it's
Definitely.
not like Europe is the first priority, but Europe is one of the most relevant markets in cybersecurity. So Europe is a cornerstone market for everyone, and they want to become global champions. So even for an American company, at some point they need to come here to Europe, and we are the ones in a good position to help them.
You mentioned how the cybersecurity as an industry has been growing over these
Exactly.
last few years. How would you say is your modus operandi to identify opportunities in this space? Because there's this tradition that cybersecurity was very specific issues that we as users face on our day-to-day, and nowadays security, when whoever is building a digital platform, is probably the number one priority because it's an integral part of the experience that
Exactly.
any user have with the platform. How has that shifted, or not necessarily shifted, but influenced the approach that you have in identifying these businesses in this space and the value that they create for whoever uses their platforms?
So what we again, I mentioned 4,000 startups,
Yeah.
right? And the 4,000 startups today were not the 2,000,
Yeah.
3,000, 10 years ago, as you can imagine, right? So the market as a whole, in terms of spending, it evolved from roughly 70 billion to 200 billion today.
Yeah.
And the thing is, and I can actually, why we are seeing cybersecurity as a fundamental trend, which in fact it is, right? And with that, the huge value creation potential that exists by investing or being exposed to cybersecurity companies, right? So today, the cybercrime is on the trillions. The impact of the cybercrime is on the trillions. Ransomware, which is a very
Yeah.
familiar term for everyone, increased by 70% last year
Wow.
and not decelerating. If we think on the impact of of the attacks, this year we had for the first time an attack with an impact over a billion in a single company.
Yeah.
So this is the dimension that we are talking about. If we think on the number of people working in cybersecurity, there are 5 million people working in cybersecurity. What's the gap? How many people do we need more? 4 million.
Wow.
So,
Almost double.
so that's a huge driver for
Yeah.
automation. That's a huge. So it's a market that we can call underserved, right? So it is a board matter. So there's responsibility in the boards around cybersecurity breaches, right? So
Yeah.
if there's a breach and if the right processes, the regulation is not there, the board is responsible. So this all summing all this, it means that cybersecurity, if you go to the list of the or the priorities of the CIO, the Chief Information
Yeah.
Officer,
Yeah.
cybersecurity is number one, number two. So AI now is number one,
Yeah.
but cybersecurity is there. And when times go, so when things go south, cybersecurity is the last thing you cut. So that has been boosting significantly the market spending, and it's not going to decline by far, right?
Yeah.
So McKinsey, for example, they have a study that they estimate that the real market, it's not the 200 billion, it's above 1 trillion. Because if companies were rightly protected, they should have been they should spend way more than they do. And again, 4 million people missing in this market, right?
Yeah.
So this is a journey. So we were kind of pioneers by accident investing in cybersecurity in Europe, but has been a journey that we've been following and in some sense participating, right? Now, when you compare Europe versus other markets, of course, the US is way more advanced, and there are countries like Israel producing a third of the unicorns that we see in the US, right?
Yeah.
So Europe still has a gap, but the good news is that we are building the right blocks, starting from a good seed stage environment and then
Yeah.
building now a Series A, Series B, and onwards, right?
But I'm glad you mentioned that because one thing about security is that it can mean different things depending on the region that you are. And
Exactly.
in Europe, there's been a lot of preeminence in terms of data, how data is used,
Exactly,
and how
exactly, exactly.
companies not only take advantage, but how they use the data that their users generate. In America, can be a different thing, and in Asia, for example, can be a different thing. So being
Yeah,
a global player or being a global venture capital that helps
exactly.
companies in different markets, how does this difference influence the support that you give to the companies that are operating in that space?
It's a good question. So it has to do, in a sense, or on one side with the maturity of the market itself. So on average, US companies spend way more than the European companies in cybersecurity, and it's not. Of course, they are being attacked on a daily basis, but Europe is also heavily exposed now with, and we can elaborate a bit on the geopolitical
Yeah, yeah,
element there. But if we think on the spending per market versus GDP, the US, they are probably spending the double or twice as much as Europe, right?
yeah,
But Europe is growing more in absolute terms than the US. So Europe is kind of catching up. Bearing in mind this maturity, it means that everyone kind of has the baseline. And the baseline means that you are kind of okay. But guess what? Criminals don't don't they know that, right? And they always try to choose the easiest way to enter into a certain company, right?
yeah,
If they want to attack. And in this sense, of course, you can imagine that the U.S. companies are more protected than the European ones. So if you think on different segments, I would say that the most emerging segments, the traction tends to be higher in the U.S.
yeah,
And here in Europe, they are kind of more conservative, partly because they still are around, I would say, catching up in the basics, right? But again, the good news is that we see more and more corporates interested in partnering with us, precisely not because we can help on the budget for next year,
yeah,
but because they want to have the sensitivity to what's next. What will be the threats in the next 2, 3 years, right?
yeah,
And that's what we can help with, right? Because we are looking at, and that's the way you asked that a little while ago. So the way we operate in such an overwhelming ecosystem is we try to select the spaces, the emerging spaces that we think are have the most of the potential,
yeah,
right? So are more emerging. So companies in those, then we identify the companies in those spaces, right? They are not even ready for us to invest because we only invest after 1 million ARR.
okay,
So they tend to be earlier stage, but we start to engage with them. We start to help them. To your point, and that also works in our favor, but it benefits the company. So when we think a company has a certain potential in, of course, in one of the spaces we are looking at, we try to put them in contact with our network. And by that, of course, we create goodwill, right?
yeah,
Because it's a commercial opportunity on one side, but for us, it's also very valuable because we have privileged insights on how a customer sees that technology,
yeah,
sees that company, right? And that feeds into the decision process down the road when the time comes for
yeah,
us to invest. And at the same time, so by engaging with them, by tracking them, we one thing that we try to do is we try to preempt rounds. So it's not
yeah,
like we go to the competitive rounds because
yeah,
they tend to be, competitive
yeah,
and all that. So we kind of try to work more the relationship because again, this is an industry where you are building long-term relationships, right?
yeah,
So all the founders that I supported in the past, in the previous life of a corporate VC,
yeah,
they are collaborating with us. They are investors in this fund. They are part of our extended team. So we iterate, we collaborate on a regular basis, and the same will happen with the new founders that we are onboarding in our
yeah.
portfolio.
And you just mentioned your fund, and you just recently launched a fund with the support of the EIF.
Exactly.
How it's been important, especially taking these issues that we were just discussing, to have the support of a key entity within the European context. to kind of tackle the challenges that we as Europeans have in this market? And what, being a global player, what do you believe are kind of key takeaways that you take from having experience in markets such as the US and other regions
Right.
to implement them in Europe and make us more competitive also
Yeah.
in that
So
space?
let me take the first one, and then
Yeah, yeah,
you
yeah,
will need to remind me the second one.
yeah,
But
yeah, yeah.
so the experience with the IF, I think actually, again from Portugal, our positioning is more or less on the sweet spot of a gap that we are seeing in the market, which is if on one side Europe represents roughly 30% of the market spending in cybersecurity, if you look at the weight of Europe on the VC investment in cybersecurity, it has been around 12, 13, 14%. So there's a huge gap. There's this 1.5, 2 billion gap in terms of investment needs in Europe, let alone the need that companies in Europe need to navigate the fragmentation of the market by design. So
Yeah, yeah,
it's we are talking about 27 countries, right? So the discussions with the IF have always been around. Look, we do have so we have more developers than the US. We have a very good R&D in Europe when compared to the US in cybersecurity. I mean,
yeah.
right? We do have a market if we are able to help companies leverage the scale of the market. So how come we don't have an ecosystem as advanced as the US? And the way we see it is we need to build on top of what we already have. So we have a very good seed stage, we have very good specialized seed investors in cybersecurity helping companies to create a product. We sit on the next level, right? So when the companies need to expand across Europe, Series A, B. Again, this applies to the European companies, also applies to companies coming from the US, for example. But in Europe, it's
Yeah,
quite clear, right? The thing is, we are global. So meaning that since inception, we started to invest globally because Europe is not the most advanced market, and we believe that that exposure, that visibility, that activity, being active in those markets, is actually very beneficial for whatever we do in Europe. Because in Europe, so again, when we look at the space, we rank the companies irrespective of the geography. So we identify the companies in the US, in Israel, in Europe, right? And that helps us to really identify the ones that have the potential to become not national champions, not European champions, global champions. And that's of course the key, the critical thing we believe Europe needs to go after. It's
yeah,
not building national champions, European champions. Forget about that. We need someone. So and there are a lot of cases of European companies that are global champions in cybersecurity, but they had to go at an early stage to the US.
yeah,
So kind of forgetting this complexity that we have in Europe. So the discussions with the IF have been always around the matching their policies and their rules with the our mandate. So our mandate, it doesn't perfectly fit the rules by default, namely in terms of capital deployment,
yeah,
because there's a certain obligation in terms of capital deployment in the U27, right? So we had a challenge there, but we are very happy that they looked at us, they approved us, and they opened an exception to have us on board.
yeah,
They entered not only with they also managed the process for the sovereign fund of Luxembourg. So they kind of managed the entire process. So
yeah,
again, we got the IF, but we can also claim that we have the sovereign fund of Luxembourg
yeah,
into the fund. And and again, now it's a matter of putting this in place and having EIF in this thesis of investment a lot centered around Europe is for us is critical because we whenever we mention we explain the thesis, right, saying well EIF is not here yet
yeah,
and the EIF is entering a bit late on our fund, right, because we already started to deploy in 23.
yeah,
So they are entering now. We already have 4 investments. We are active as we speak, But the reality was when we had to explain, well, the IF is looking at this, but look, they are struggling a bit because of the mandate versus their rules. It was a kind of at least some noise. It was creating noise, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So of course, having IF and the due diligence process that they do, the analysis that they do, because in the end we are talking about competitive processes, right? So having AIF has an extreme value because it's also a validation point for a lot of family offices, for a lot of investors that see AIF as a reference.
Yeah.
And of course now we need to leverage this in the remaining period that we have to fundraise.
Carlos, thank you very much for
Thank you
spending
for
this
having
time
me.
with us.